I think that's it. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. I hope that's working. I hope everybody can see us. Welcome to the Good Web Festival. Thank you so much for joining us. We are here as Demos, supported by GCHQ, really to answer one question. When we think about design, plan for a future internet, what does good look like? And it turns out it's a pretty easy question. Good is 5 back-to-back Zoom meetings on a Friday. So, you know, you're welcome. My name is Alex. I look after the Good Web Project. And for a year, we with GCHQ, our friends and partners have been working together on these questions. We're a weird mix. Computer scientists, architects, journalists, philosophers, artists, neuroscientists, politicians, community organizers, all trying to sort of articulate, measure, and advocate for an internet that is compatible with democracy. What does good look like? A few years ago, my girlfriend was complaining that we didn't do enough romantic stuff. So I booked a weekend away in Lyme Regis. Now, it turns out Lyme Regis is possibly the least romantic place on God's green earth, but it is excellent if you like fossils. And luckily, I had brought a claw hammer and heavy-duty rucksack on this romantic getaway. So we're walking down the beach and we find this fossil. I have it here. There you go. I don't know if you can see it. And it's really exciting. So I post it on social media and nobody cares and calls me a fossil nerd or whatever. And then I post it on thefossilforum.com. And it is one of the most wholesome experiences of my life. Fossil Dude 19, a man from Connecticut with 31,000 posts, cleans up my photos for me. Evie from Finch Dean warns me of fossil addiction. Texas's own Dino Mike puts it up for Fossil of the Month, which it doesn't win, by the way, which I think is a great injustice. The Fossil Forum is an amazing place. It's really good. But if you think about the conversations we have, those in politics, the media, maybe in the pub back in the day, it's clear to me that we know what bad looks like. I joined Demos a couple of years after the Arab Spring in 2011. I remember it being an incredible moment of hope, but it turns out also of hubris, the vanguard, the sight of smartphones in Tahrir Square, and the sense that the internet might be the vanguard for democracy around the world. But the years passed and it never really happened. And that optimism began to fade, I feel, in the face of everything we were witnessing online. You name it, right? Extremist recruitment, hate speech, the abuse of parliamentarians, disinformation. Each year, a new harm for the headlines. We know what bad looks like. The problem is the future architects of the internet are not thinking about what bad looks like. They do have a vision for the future of the web. Beijing knows what good looks like. Moscow knows what good looks like. Silicon Valley knows what good looks like. These are visions for a future internet that probably aren't in 100% alignment with what we want. Authoritarian regimes are increasingly coherent in their plans for the web, and it's high time we came together with our friends and allies and partners to advocate for our own. I think we need to do 3 things. Articulate, measure, advocate. Articulate. Our language is out of date. We need to speak the same language. When the UK government says it wants the internet to be safe, what does safe mean? When we talk about private spaces online or public spaces, what are we talking about? How do we talk clearly, compellingly? How do we sell the idea of a free and an open and a secure internet? 2 is measure. We need an evidence base for what good looks like because it's out there. Wikipedia, Stack Overflow, the Fossil Forum that I love so dearly. Where are the communities empowered to shape and create spaces that are safe, loved, nurtured, and so on? Spaces that people feel proud of. How do you do it? And how do you regulate in a way that encourages that good as well as stamping out the bad? And lastly, advocate. We need to build a coalition of the willing. A coalition of the willing of friends and allies around the world, here in the US, in the EU, but we have very different views about the future of the web. Perhaps, you know, whether it's in the US or even in India or Taiwan or some of the other, we need consensus here. I think everybody has shared values, but now we need to find consensus on what that translates to. And finding that consensus and measuring consensus is at the core of what the Good Web Project is looking to do. So over the last year, we've started this process. So have a look at the research. Hopefully a colleague of mine will post it in the chat, you know. What's in a name is a look at how anonymity can work online. A room of one's own explores what a private space is online. What are public spaces? Good Foundations explores the future of internet protocols, the technology underlying the web that doesn't get talked about enough in shaping the web we see every day. Everything in Moderation, got puns for days at Demos. It's a key development point here. Everything in Moderation says we need to explore community power as the way to make spaces healthy and better, rather than purely demanding a top-down, centralized approach to content moderation. And states, corporations, individuals, and machines asks us to find the best balance of power between those four forces going forward. Now, we've got a lot left to do, a lot to talk about today, and I hope you'll join us as supporters of the work, as members of this network, and as voices thinking about the future of the web. Before I wrap up, some thank yous first and foremost to GCHQ for joining us today and supporting the work today. I can honestly say I haven't had the privilege of working with a group of people so thoughtful and sensitive and brave enough to let us take the risks in pushing what is a really difficult subject forward. Thank you so much. Enormous thanks also to our speakers. It's an amazing lineup today, and I feel so privileged you've given up your time and expertise today. Demos, to Toby, who you'll see in the chat there, who's managed to get us all into this amazing platform, and without this whole thing, without him, this whole thing would have been impossible. To Maeve and Josh Tapper for turning this whole idea into a reality, and to Polly, our chief exec, for all her backing, guidance, and support. And of course, my Good Web Project team, Ellen, Josh, Kieran, Chasm, and also Lindsay, Peter, Chloe at all our partner organizations who are responsible for the actual thinking here while I wonder about the Fossil Forum. And thank you, of course, to you guys all for joining us today. So with that, let's get the show on the road. First off, some housekeeping. We're recording most of the sessions today, so you'll be able to look back on them, but I don't think your chats will appear in any final recording, so don't worry about that. Take this opportunity if you want to update your profile. I think it's in the top right corner, who you are, where you were. There's a chat at the side of the screen. Use it. We want to hear from you. Please join the debate. Say hello, introduce yourself. I know it's not very British, but it is a safe space, as we've come to expect. And if this isn't intimate enough, hit the networking function and meet someone one-on-one, like speed dating, but nerdier. And join us on the Twitter, lastly, using the hashtag GoodWeb. Now, we're cooking off the discussion on what good looks like, debating some thorny questions, then there'll be some TED Talks around lunch, and then we'll be wrapping up with another discussion of regulation. My colleagues at Demos will be on hand to help you throughout the day, so do grab anyone with Demos on their profile if you get stuck. So, with that out the way, let's do this. Introducing my superstar panelists for the first event of the day. Damien Collins, MP for Folkestone and Hythe, a member of the Real Facebook Oversight Board. Delphine Halgan Mishra, Executive Director of the Signals Network and Lead Rapporteur on the Working Group on Infodemics. Natasha Kimani, Strategy Lead at Africa No Filter, working on shifting the African narrative. And finally, Peter Pomerantsev, Good Web Project Lead, Fellow at Arena at Johns Hopkins, and author of This Is Not Propaganda. And I suppose there is only one place to start, really, is, what does good mean to you when you're thinking about the internet? Damien, maybe we could turn to you first.
Thank you. Great to be with you. Well, good should be that everyone has a positive experience and a fair chance, just like in any other sphere of life. Too often people's experience, particularly with social media, is negative if they are the subject of abuse, or they are given disinformation on important matters like COVID vaccines and or important information about elections and democracy. But can also be banned if you're a business. So if you're a business or an app developer looking to sell your app to customers and develop an audience for it, then you're often reliant on working through other big tech platforms. And do they always give you a fair deal? If you're too successful, do they impose restrictions on your trade? Do they favor their own products and services and try and draw customers away from you? What sort of fair chance do people get when they develop their businesses and their audiences through the internet? What's happened over the last 5 or 6 years in particular is we've seen one nation of the web is a very free, very open, very wide, very democratic one. I think in turn replaced by something which is a web that is dominated by several big companies and an all-out war breaking out for our attention, to capture as much of our attention as possible, to allow these companies to be as commercially dominant as possible. And that's had a number of consequences. And there's a lot we can talk about on that, but I think in particular when you look at the issue of disinformation and hate speech online, one of the reasons that's proliferated is not just because people are posting the content. People have always said unpleasant things about other people. People have always told lies and spread rumors and conspiracy theories. But in the days when you could only do that in a coffee house or at Hyde Park Corner, the damage you could do through doing that was relatively limited. When you do that in an environment where you have social media platforms whose business model is based solely on capturing people's attention, so you can target advertising out, you can make money from ads. The longer they're online, the more money you make. When that's your business model, and therefore engagement is your business model, and you're not really bothered about what people engage with as long as you hold their attention, then that can be a bad place, because that creates that's a model that creates perverse disincentives for people to promote conspiracy theories and extremist content and information, because people are engaged with it. And in an environment like that, what good looks like is companies being more responsible for the tools they've created to make money, and considering the wider impact on society they have. This is by no means a sort of anti-tech agenda. And if it wasn't for tech, we wouldn't be having this conversation now. And in the last year, we've seen in particular so much of the benefits tech brings to society. But I think we also need to consider some of the consequences of that, some of the harms that can come. And for me, that's a bit like saying that, if you believe this is an agenda that should be taken more seriously and the companies should do more, you're no more anti-tech than you would be anti-car for saying that cars should have seatbelts. And I think the debate we need to have now is to say, what sort of guardrails do we need to put in place to make the experience online successful for everyone who's engaged with it?
Thanks, Damien. I think that's a really important way to sort of kick us off, thinking about guardrails, thinking about this in terms of the expectations we have around these platforms. I think what those guardrails look like is one of the real subjects. And Delphine, I think your work on infodemics. I mean, there's 250 recommendations, 250 sets of guardrails. How do we sort of, what does good look like? How do we move towards that? Looking from your perspective.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me here. I have to say that to prepare kind of what I would say, I kind of went back actually to what I was saying 8 years ago when I was at Reporters Without Borders and commenting the Arab Spring, because and it was interesting to go back to what were our expectations at that time, and really I think at that time the good web was illustrated by our understanding or realization that the web is a tool to circulate information, to circumvent traditional censorship. And really, I thought again of this Tunisian street vendor, Mohamed Bouazizi, you remember, who set himself on fire as a tragedy. And his story was relayed on social media, and that sparked the Arab Spring. And really, I remember that as a really, it's really, I think, when most of people realize that really the internet was a very powerful tool to build social movement, to empower people, to circumvent censorship, and to obtain change in a very brutal way, but and not in a perfect way, but really it was that realization. We also realized very quickly that these advantages came with a very high price. That's really when we realized that bloggers were, for example, targeted as well as traditional journalists. That's when we saw the murder of Mexican bloggers, the arrest of Vietnamese blogger, and really when we realized also the importance of the massive surveillance by states of individuals. We realized the need to regulate surveillance softwares sold to repressive regime. So when I'm thinking of what the good web would be, I'm thinking that the good web will be a web where we would have solved this reality, where we would have solved state surveillance in order to oppress opposition, where we would have solved capitalism surveillance, where we would have solved online propaganda, where we would have solved and stopped internet interruption, because that's also something that we're seeing more and more. The more and more governments are just cutting the internet to control what's happening in their own country. So for me, a good web is a web that is not cut, that is not slowed down to limit what people can do online. I mentioned the need to regulate the sale of surveillance software, the need to create democratic oversight on the dominant companies that Damien's mentioned that are controlling our or public information ecosystem. I kind of went on and think that, yes, we need to create safety standards, like we created seatbelt standards for cars. There's no seatbelt equivalent for the web right now. And we are seeing that there's an urgent need for this. We need to, I think, regulate the Internet of Things, the amplitude of how the web is going everywhere in our life. And yesterday I was reading, for example, that Amazon is really starting to launch huge projects in the healthcare system. So how do we want a web where companies have so much power that they know as much what our grocery shopping to our healthcare concerns? That's a web that worries me when there's such powerful companies. I think a good web is not a web that is a juxtaposition of different web. It's not we need to find a way to stop the creation of a Chinese internet, Iranian internet, Facebook internet, and so on, because I think we are going towards different webs, and I don't think that's maybe what we want. I think we need to think of how the good web should be respectful of the climate, because definitely there's huge consumption of energy to make this web possible, and we need to think of that in one thing. And I think at the end, to finish, you see I can have a long list, but to finish, I think we need to also realize how entertainment, social interaction, education, trade are now happening even more, maybe more online than in real life, and how actually is that the life we want? Do we want to have all our life, social life, educational life, online, or maybe how can we even protect the good life in offline? And that's, I think, societal questions that should be debated in our societies, not just to think of what a good online world looks like, but how to preserve and take care of our good offline world, if I may say. So just a list of thoughts here, and I look forward to hear Natasha's and Peter's thoughts on that and to continue the conversation.
Yeah, I mean, these are super important. It's all getting a little bit of an echo, Delphine. Natasha, I mean, Damien brought up the power of the major platforms of technology in this space. Delphine's talked about actually where government can have power, and maybe you can see it in whether it's in the Iranian internet, or the Chinese internet, or actually just governments pulling the plug. So in your experience, when we think about who's at the steering wheel and who's driving this forward, how has that been reflected in the work that you do, thinking about narratives in African narratives?
Well, thanks, Alex. I think the question here first is to ask good for whom, because good web, I mean, it could be good for internet providers. They're making a killing during this particular pandemic period. A lot of people are making money off it, but when it comes to internet freedoms, we've seen in a lot of countries it has declined. We've seen access to internet is prohibitively expensive for the average African. And so when a practical example, when a lot of young upper middle class and middle class Kenyans were learning through the internet, a lot of Kenyans in the rural area were suffering because they couldn't have access to internet. They either didn't have a platform or they couldn't afford data bundles. So when we say it's good for some people and not for others because there's lack of access. And let's talk about internet freedom as well. We found that a lot of governments, not naming any, have used the guise of protecting public health during the COVID pandemic and using that to restrict internet freedoms and to shut down a lot of platforms and to sort of curb activism and freedom of speech. So it hasn't been good for a lot of activists. And it hasn't been good for the average African trying to engage in different spaces. And I don't want to say this is particularly the case for Africans. We've seen it's a global problem. So I think good internet and the good web is access. Easy access, internet freedom, the freedom for everyday people to be able to engage without the fear of being shut down, without the fear of being curbed because the government has decided today that this infringes on one or two of their rights. And we found, I also, again, don't want to speak about any particular country, a lot of internet policies and legislation is coming into place that really is designed to ensure state supremacy and state authority over these social media platforms and the internet, which in turn has led to a decline in freedom of speech and engagement. But I would like to also speak solely around narratives and how, because again, this pandemic period, a lot of us have been online. And we are shaped by what we see, read, and engage with culture-wise. And how we view and engage, for example, with Africa, is shaped by largely what we read and what we hear. So this is a call onto a lot of social media platforms. And these platforms, we briefly discussed this earlier on, Alex, are owned by largely Western organizations. White Western organizations, white men in Silicon Valley who have no experience or nuanced understanding about the everyday lives of minority individuals, or more so Africans at large. And when they come into our space, we are often at a disadvantage because of the power dynamic. And you find when there's a prevalence of disinformation, especially when it comes to the global south, there's little power for the everyday individual to be able to shield themselves against these consequences or these challenges that come about. I'll give an example. I lived in London for a period of time, and every time someone would ask me if I'm a marathon runner, first of all, I do not look like I could run more than 10 kilometers without dying. Your assumption, because I'm Kenyan, then I must either be a marathon runner or live in a hut, is just based off of the misconceptions that you have seen online or through media. So how can we ensure that the web is safe enough or good enough to perpetuate the everyday realities of Africans and not sort of like a misconstrued misconception about how I live or how I experience my reality? So there are a lot of things that are good about the internet and the web, but there are things that still leave me as an African at a disadvantage because I don't have the power of global media. We don't have that power where everything that you may be consuming about the continent is skewed towards a particular thing that doesn't represent our everyday realities. So when we are speaking about global organizations such as large online platforms, we should also be talking about the space and the opportunity to engage positively and to shift harmful and stereotypical narratives within and about the continent and other countries and continents at large. So I'm just going to stop there, and we could engage further on the same.
Thanks, Natasha. That's a really important point, sort of question in I suppose in the chat and to the audience here as well. How do we differentiate between people having a presence on a platform and people having power on a platform, and what the difference is there? I think that's super important. Damien mentioned equality of opportunity. Delphine, you sort of spoke a little bit about access. Natasha, you too, freedom of speech. We're talking, Peter, here in terms of big sort of liberal democratic principles here. Is that really how we should be thinking about this question of what does a good internet look like? And you're on mute. You're on mute, Peter.
See, I was present but had no power. I think it's a very good place to start. When we talk about the good, and I suppose what you're talking about is really the liberal democratic web, one that's in line with those principles. We're not really talking about the good. We're talking about the less shit web. Liberal democracy is about giving rights and creating checks and balances. I think Ron Debert's called it, we need restraint on the internet, the restraint of states, the restraint of companies. And everything that we've been talking about here is basically good old-fashioned rights, but brought into the internet realm. The right to have a say in governing them, the right to have a say in influencing the algorithms, maybe breaking up some of the monopoly power of these huge companies, the lack of rights on the authoritarian internet. And I'm completely with that. I think that's a very, very good place to start. The only thing that nags at me is that, liberal democracy was about checks and balances and rights, also in the long term, producing successful societies. The great claim that both the Chinese and in their own way, some of the influential voices in the Silicon Valley debate make is that your lousy rights and checks and balances don't matter in a world ruled by mass data. The argument essentially is that totalitarianism may have failed in the 20th century, but now it's back and it will succeed because the only way to be successful and powerful and efficient in this new world is by amassing as much data as possible. That's kind of what Silicon Valley and the Chinese are saying. That's the challenge they're throwing down. They say, fine, you can do a slow European internet in the EU and you'll fail. Yeah, we'll have better businesses, better services, a more efficient society, smarter cities. It's a real challenge. It's as big as the challenge that was thrown down at the start of the 20th century when we were told that totalitarian centralization is a better model than liberal democracy. So we have to be aware of when we're defending rights, when we're instituting all these things that we're talking about, that it's also kind of a model for success, which makes us think very deeply about what is success. Is it just greater efficiency or is it something else? And so I think when we talk about the good web, we're also talking about, what makes for a good society. And I suppose, to take it down even another level, there's an argument here about what it means to be human, which might sound rather grand, but I do think this is what it comes down to. The argument of Silicon Valley and China is that our data knows more about us than we do. Yes, give up your rights, give up your data, but we will find you the ideal wife, the ideal home, the ideal, career, the ideal society. Because your data knows more than you do. I don't agree with that. I actually think that human choice, engagement, all these values will create a better society in the long run. But we have to see kind of like the depth of the challenge being thrown down. I don't think it's hard conceptually to move the language of rights into the online space. The real challenge is to then make sure that, the society we create out of that is a successful and a happy one, dare I say.
Thank you, Peter. Yeah, and that's really a really sort of profound view on
very profound.
Was a difficult question. I think I'm struck by a kind of an optimistic note, and I think I feel more optimistic when I look around the world. But perhaps that's a little naive. Damien, from your sort of vantage point from government, where is the UK? How's the UK doing on all this? Are we out here on our own, with our approach to regulation, or do you see the work that is being done in government and perhaps in the UK more broadly as being part of a kind of a wider effort? Are we heading in the right direction? Question mark. And if we are we doing it alone, or do you see us as having friends on the way?
We're definitely moving in the right direction. I sometimes wish we could move a bit faster, but feels like we've been talking about a lot of these issues for quite a long time now. But so in the UK, we have the Online Harms Bill this year. So the idea of creating actual legal liabilities for the way platforms moderate and promote and content and the way duty of care responsibilities for them for removing harmful content and not amplifying it. So those are all really important. There's a second process which has really been led by the Competition and Markets Authority, which this year we'll see the creation of a new digital markets unit to create a new specialist unit to start to look at questions around abuse of market power by big tech companies. But then if you look at elsewhere around the world, so a similar process is being run in the European Union, The European Commission before Christmas published the Digital Markets Act and the Digital Services Act, which set out very slightly different approach, but very similar sorts of principles. We've seen the big row in Australia about big tech companies being asked to pay for news. Now that's not really an issue that is just about news. It's really come out of a very substantial competition investigation by the Australian regulators looking at the disruption of the advertising market in Australia, where the display ad market, 80% of the display ad market is controlled by Google and Facebook. The consequence of that is newspapers have seen their ad revenues fall by 50% since 2006. So that's going on there. Then in America, which is obviously key, I think with the new administration, we could see quite a different approach. Joe Biden was quite outspoken about tech companies needing to take more responsibility, quite critical of Facebook's role in elections and allowing conspiracy theories and disinformation and targeting of voters for voter suppression reasons and by the Russians in elections as well. And then, although it's early days of the new administration, you look at some of the people who have been appointed. Bruce Reed, who's the Deputy White House Chief of Staff, he co-authored an article before Christmas that was, again, calling for the end of Section 230, the end of platform neutrality in America, the appointment of Tim Wu to the National Economic Council at the White House as well, someone again from Columbia University, very pro-tech regulation. Similarly, Lena Khan, who advised the Congressional Committee on Antitrust, has been nominated for the Federal Trade Commission. So you see a number of quite key appointments who will have a big say in tech policy in the next 4 years in America. And I would say they are all on the side of saying we need these guardrails, we need better protections, we need the companies to take more responsibility.
Delphine, from your perspective, thinking about, I mean, sometimes it's quite easy to forget that the EU and the UK differ on these questions, and obviously we differ in a massive way with the US, who obviously see the question of platform regulation, or traditionally have seen that question in a very different light. Now, it sounds from what Damien's saying, I think if we look at the appointees, there is some kind of convergence here across the US, the UK, the EU, perhaps even more globally. Would you comment on that a little bit?
Yeah, I think there's a general understanding, acceptation that it is time to end the self-regulation that these major internet companies benefit from today. I think that has been understood by all the legislator and government everywhere. And it's time to put in place smart public regulation, especially, I believe, to start with on transparency requirements on platform, and to invent new models of co-regulation, because we are facing, it's not just how do we put a seatbelt on a car, we're facing new technical and technological challenges. And I do believe that also to do this right, the public regulation needs to have strong democratic safeguards as well, because the powers of the regulators, even if we limit it to transparency requirements of platform, and we don't even think of creating a kind of ministry of truth who could say what should stay on the platform, what should not. We should definitely basically decide on the content that should be on platform. Even if we don't go that far for the powers of regulators, there still need to be strong democratic safeguards, because we need these regulators to be independent of any part of the executives, for example. And we need to make sure that court decision assess and independent court decision are also used for this public regulation. But I also feel that it's time for the democratic governments to get together and to even think together of what a new global governance could look like in order to ensure an effective and coordinated democratic oversight over these platforms. Because otherwise, I'm afraid that we're going towards more and more national internet or national laws, and it would become impossible to have a British reality versus a US realities versus a European realities. And I do believe it's time for maybe not a Bretton Woods, but maybe what the democratic leaders did after the 2008 financial crisis. They got together and tried to create new check and balance systems to get the financial world in order. So I hope that with the new US administration, the effort led in the UK, the DSA, I actually more than hope, I believe it's the right time for democratic governments to get together to show a way of what global democratic oversight of platforms could look like, and to show the way to African countries, Asian countries, to bring them together towards the norms that the leading democratic governments can create. And I hope that for example, the Summit for Democracy is announced by the Biden administration, or the G7, or French announced also a kind of Summit for Democracy at the UN General Assembly in September, so that these kind of events will be key steps towards a new democratic global governance. And I don't know what it looks like. I'm not saying let's create a new UN of the internet. I'm just saying these new rules need to be fought together to be efficient and to help us towards the right direction.
So we have, whether it's in the UN, that we have this sort of sense here from Damien and from Delphine, Peter, that liberal democracies are kind of coming together. Are we going to win? Oh shit! Sorry, I muted you. You have to unmute. There we go.
Are we going to win? Oh my God. Listen, at least the challenge is now being framed. At least we're talking about, the many permutations of the challenge. At least there's the EU has sent out some sort of a dove towards the US, saying we need to think about internet regulation, the future of the internet, in terms of shared values. But this is the point where, as you say, we really lack a language. Yes, there's some really basic rights that we need to introduce around transparency and governance, but look, those are really the really bare minimum things. That's just the start of it. When we talk about shared values and the information environment, we do have a little bit of a lack of kind of fleshing out what we mean. I'll give you an example. So on the Digital Service Act, the EU document, it talks about something called civic discourse. The internet regulation needs to protect civic discourse. I mean, do we really know what that means? If civic discourse were to come and mug me tomorrow in a dark alley, would I know? We really don't understand yet. The thing that might slightly sharpen people's minds is oddly enough, the question of security. Sometimes I think there's a growing understanding that outright hostile states like China and Russia, but also authoritarian, curious states all over the place, and also within democracies, there's a real threat to our kind of survival sometimes. And that helps to sharpen minds a little bit, that this is not just a la-di-da question about, let's talk about the internet. This is actually about, how do we keep strong, vibrant, open, democratic states in a time of new types of threats from extremists, from hostile states, which are often playing out online. Maybe that'll help concentrate minds a little bit. Of course, it's very important not to securitize this discourse. We can't start looking for security solutions to what are our political questions, but maybe it'll make us a little bit more aware.
Natasha, do you share that optimism? There's, thinking about some of the voices that Africa No Filter have been promoting, either directly or indirectly, it does feel like there's a sense of momentum here, that there is growth. Do you share that optimism?
I would say yes, partly I do, because for many reasons, the internet has become a place, or is a place, where we're able to experience the world differently. We are also able to shape conversations. And I'll give practical examples, like the NSAS movement that was generated by young Nigerians across different platforms was generated because young people felt their voices needed to be heard in a context where they felt that they were unheard by government and their freedoms were being curtailed. This was their way to speak out, engage, and ensure that they were being heard in the best way possible. So there is space for growth, engagement, and learning and unlearning. However, before I get to that, I would like to maybe just my fear about what Delphine raised often, maybe, and not the Bretton Woods example or the UN example, is that oftentimes when such forums are created, often Asia and Africa are an afterthought. And we are considered people who need to be taught or given an example, when clearly we should be at the table making decisions that affect our everyday lives. And oftentimes when these organizations are coming to Africa, I rarely see companies seeking out local expertise on the political and cultural contexts in markets where they have a presence or where their products are widely used. And these consultations with civil societies would be great because they should inform the company's approaches or approach to content moderation, managing government requests, and countering disinformation, amongst other things. But because we are not considered sort of large players or important enough to have these conversations, it rarely happens. And responses to the challenges that our contexts face is normally a knee-jerk reaction to something. And it's not something that's been thought through and sort of been incorporated into company policies and plans. So if there were to be such a forum, I would say that it needs to be constituted with the reality that we understand our context and we understand how the good web affects our everyday lives. And therefore, there's no one sort of, fit to everything. There are different nuances and contexts. And with that, I would say, Alex, in that space, there is hope and there's room for growth and conversation. But if that doesn't happen, and if companies don't take the first step of engaging civil society organizations, engaging local expertise, then we'll find the situation where it's a top-down approach that is not relevant and doesn't fit context. So if we are approaching it from that direction, then I do believe that there's room for growth and room for nuance. I would also like to challenge the issue of disinformation and content moderation, where it happens almost flawlessly in the West, and we don't see the same happening in the African context, where disinformation is sort of is the norm and allowed and not moderated as effectively as we see in Western countries. So this is also a challenge to these companies, that content moderation and review of these things should happen. Again, I've spoken about this, but prioritizing users' freedom of expression and speech should be a priority, but within context, understanding that we need to preserve broad protections, but also ensure that that it is a safe space to do so. And I'm going to stop there before I become an activist and go on and on about things I'm passionate about.
No, I could, but that's such an important point. If you think about the investment that many of the social media platforms put into sort of safeguarding the American election, that is not represented around the globe, and I think it really sort of speaks to this idea that. Ultimately we can't just be defined by our advertising marketing cap as our sort of measure of value. I want to just finish before we go to some questions from the from the audience. With I sort of talked about the Fossil Forum, and maybe I can link you to the original forum post. I promise you, it is real. There are some who whether it's spaces or platforms. Natasha, perhaps we can come to you first. If there are spaces or platforms or people that you think really are driving forward this constructive vision for a good internet, for me it would be the Fossil Forum, or maybe Wikipedia, or maybe the work of Eli Pariser in America, whatever it might be. So people who are driving forward these conversations. Who if somebody in our audience was to follow up to look into something, who would you suggest, Or where would you go? Oh, what have you got? We need to unmute you. Oh, I can't unmute you. Unmute, Natasha. Wait. We need to unmute. Yeah.
Oh my God. I've become those people who speak on mute. I'm so sorry. This is one of the books I'd really like to recommend by Nanjala Nyabola that really unpacks how digital democracies have worked and the growing digital divide in some countries and how we could have conversations that are constructive and moving forward. So I genuinely recommend some young scholars like Nanjala who have been bold enough to have these challenging conversations. There are quite a number of organizations that I can't think of at the top of my head that I will type on the chat box that are also challenging conventions and companies on how to generate policies that are inclusive and that reflect the everyday realities of Africans. And once I remember one or two names, I will reflect the same on the chat box here. But I would like everyone to have to get this copy. It's really Digital Democracies, Analog Politics by Nanjala Nyabola, and just have a deep dive understanding of how the good web has affected how Africans engage and show up and the limitations. I see Stephanie commenting, I love the book. Thank you. Oh yes, I love the book series. So I do recommend the same. Yeah, thank you.
Damien, coming to you, what inspires you when you're thinking about this? Do you have a sense of are there people or there are organizations or platforms out there that really sort of make you think, actually, yeah, this is worth fighting for?
Well, I mean, as I said earlier on, there's a huge amount of positive stuff about the way the internet allows people to connect together, to campaign on issues in their community, to share information and ideas. I think one of the really interesting things for me personally during this last 12 months has been the idea of speaking on panels like this, but run by organizations all around the world has become a very normal thing. So the kind of dialogue conversation we have with people all around the world you might not normally see very often, or it's been really fantastic. In terms of the policy debate that we've been having as well, there are some organizations that do great work. Obviously, you should read Peter's book and listen to my Infotagion podcast. They're two great places to start. But I'd also say, I think I'd also recommend to people that want to understand more about the kind of the business of big tech and the way it works is to look at the work of people like Tristan Harris at the Center for Humane Technology in California as well. They were the group that were really behind the Social Dilemma film, and I think there's some really good work they do there, analysing a whole range of aspects around the way tech policy works.
Delphine, would you recommend Peter's book?
Of course. But actually, what I wanted to share with you is what I'm really amazed and I think can bring us optimism. It's the power of journalism. I'm actually amazed how every time a major story broke in the news, that moved things. And I'm thinking of recent example. I'm thinking of a piece by Nick Kristof in the New York Times recently. So Nick Kristof published a terrible story about Pornhub policies and how it was failing many young women. And just in few days, Pornhub actually updated their policies in the way people can upload videos. I'm thinking of a New Yorker story, which was called Why Facebook Can't Fix Itself, and which was highlighting all the Holocaust deniers' comments that you could find on Facebook. In just few days, Facebook announced that they will change their rules on Holocaust. And so basically the point I'm making here is that journalism and the voice of people has a true impact on platforms' policies. And I see it every week. I feel that it's actually the thing that change and move the policies the quickest, quicker than regulation. And I do believe that basically public opinion matters for the platforms. And that's our most powerful leverage to make things change quickly. And that's why I work at my organization, the Signals Network, to make sure that more and more media investigation hold accountable the platforms. And that's why I work every day to empower workers to be able to blow the whistles when there's things that are not right, when there's abuses in the policies, in the products that have so much impact on everybody's life. So I am very optimistic about the power of the media and of the voices. And I do believe that the real change will come from a combination of all that, from public regulation, empowerment of the tech workers, and more media investigation, because the public opinions matter for this company.
Yeah, I think that's, I also find myself sort of very inspired by, especially in the sort of US context, the sort of the rise of these sort of digital unions and increasingly, people discussing the policies underpinning these major technology platforms and fighting them both internally and externally. We've done a lot. We know a lot about scandal, but actually, when you start seeing internal movement within industry, I think that's a really positive step. Peter, what about you? Who's inspiring you here?
I nominate the people of Belarus. All of those who are struggling for their freedom, but who are using tech in a very, very, very innovative way. Telegram's played this incredible role there of helping create a civic consciousness, a political consciousness, and a kind of civic or even national identity. It's really quite stunning what's going on. Delphine opened our talk today referencing back to the Arab Spring and the kind of the disillusionment that came after that. There is actually a wave of protests the last couple of years with tech right at the heart of them that we really have to go and look at very, very carefully. My sense is that it's not just about the use of tech. It's about how identity is formed, how democratic behaviors are being developed in these environments, and how a positive sense of collective action and identity is being formed. And I think that's the real pushback, by the way, against the sort of social media-driven populism, which has demagogic leaders who've learned how to capture attention, who people follow in these online mobs with the kind of slightly fascistic emotional logic of thumbs up or thumbs down. Now, that's one version of politics, populism, and online behavior. And there's another one which is happening in these protest movements, which is the real pushback against online populism. And we need to be learning a lot more. We need to be listening to them a lot more. And Belarus is one that I know a little bit because I'm from that bit of the world, but Myanmar, Hong Kong, all across Latin America, Sudan, fantastic movements the last few years with tech playing a huge role, which I think can almost reboot, excuse the naff metaphor, that kind of sense of disappointment post-Arab Spring in tech.
Guys, thank you so much. I'm just going to open it up a little bit to the audience now. For everybody watching, again, thanks so much for coming along. We have a Q&A function. I think if you press stage and then Q&A, we'll run into some questions. I think let me just put two out there and feel free to answer whichever one you feel feel comfortable with. I think Austin has asked a bit about how regulation can play a role in this. And mentions this idea of regulating against the bad, but we in the UK we've talked a bit about sort of codes of conduct, about a duty of care. These feel like constructive ways forward to sort of incentivizing good design for platforms, good and safe design, I suppose. I suppose question one would be, to what extent do you think the UK and perhaps other liberal democracies are succeeding in incentivizing good platform design? And my second question is around, is from Stephen, which I think is more of a comment than a question, but I think speaks to this idea. And a question I'd love to ask the people here is that the cardinal sin of the internet is often very it's a debatable question, but sometimes you'll get the answer that it's the advertising model, that it's the funding model, it's the fact that everything that we use is bought and paid for with advertising money. Can you conceive of an internet that moves beyond that? And how necessary would that be? Over to you guys, who would like to go first on that? Someone's smiling. Damien, thank you.
Okay. So in terms of internet business model, well, there are different models. I mean, advertising is the predominant model for social media and search, but obviously, Netflix is a subscription service. Amazon is a retailer. Apple makes money through margin, effectively through the App Store and data storage costs. So there are, depending on the business, there are different sorts of models. So, but what you've got to think about, if you want to, as they always say, if something is free, then you're the product. So if you want to move beyond that, then you've got to think about saying, well, okay, does that mean I'm prepared to pay for a product that I think I have great value from, and actually, take Zoom, for example. I mean, Zoom works on the basis that you'll love it so much, eventually you'll want to pay for a premium version of it. So, lots of businesses have those sorts of models and can be quite successful online. So so there are different models, and it is possible to conceive of it. But even without that, let's just say for social media, a free to access product paid for from advertising, which is a model that sustained the newspaper and magazine industry, or not free to purchase, but the purchase price is subsidized by advertising. That model can work well, but there are guardrails in media that set certain standards, and we shouldn't say with social media, well, if it's free, the company should be able to do what they want, because we're getting it for nothing. And there does need to be responsibility. There does need to be a duty of care. That will only happen when there are regulators with statutory powers that can actually investigate problems and can actually have the right to know things that aren't publicly available from within the companies themselves, and have legal powers that they can enforce on the companies. So far, the only alternative to that has been public shaming. Through public shaming, largely as a result of whistleblowers and investigative journalism, companies have changed their platform policies when some of the most egregious things they let happen have been exposed to the world. But we can't have a system of self-regulation where the companies largely do what they want and publish self-reporting data that no one can analyze about how well they're doing it. There have to be external standards set if we want them to take responsibility. And we shouldn't just say, well, it's a free-to-use product, therefore they're free to do what they want. We should establish these rules. And in Australia, the only reason that Google and Facebook agreed to do these deals to pay for media was because if they didn't, Australia had legislated to say that an adjudicator would set what the remuneration would be and would enforce it. So to avoid that, they did a deal. And so you see time and time again, when you really want to improve standards, ultimately you need some sort of bodies with legal powers to deliver change.
I think that, I agree. Moving back to we were sort of thinking there about the advertising model, Peter. We've been sort of talking about the decimation of the media here. 50% cuts in revenue. Is there another way?
Look, we've been here before. So many of these challenges arose with the introduction of radio and introduction of TV. Every time a new technology transforms society, we actually repeat so many of the same questions. Radio started in the 1920s, first euphoria that it's going to bring about world peace, that people will hear each other across borders and we'll never have a war again. Then kind of paranoia as Dr. Goebbels and and Stalin really work out how to use radio in very nasty ways. And then you have the emergence of a different idea of what the radio can be through the BBC. And if you read Lord Reith's autobiography, the creator of the BBC, was first Director General, that's exactly what he says. Is that, look, there's a dictatorial, it's a bit like our debate. There's a dictatorial use of radio over here. There's an ultra commercial one that's all about polarization and hate over there in America. This is time when Father Coughlin is dominating American airwaves, an anti-Semitic fascist priest. And he goes, no, we need something else. We need radio that is public, not state-owned, that is non-commercial, and that is aimed at the public good. Now, his view of the public good is terribly paternalistic and patrician. I think today we'd have something else. But the idea that we need something which is public is not a new one. We had to have the same interventions for old media as well. So I think and we need an intervention as big as the introduction of the BBC was for radio today in our online spaces. We do need major interventions, or else we'll end up, as you said at the start, the Chinese internet on the one hand and the surveillance capitalism on the other, and the public just disappears into the mass with no power at all.
Thanks, Peter. Natasha, can I come to you next? Colette in the chat has asked you to sort of, you said you mentioned safeguarding freedom of speech, but within a contextual understanding. And I think that also speaks to some of the, it's one of the points raised by Stephen around, the importance of that a country is able to set its own rules. With regards to the internet, and obviously the challenges that brings. So would you be able to expand a little bit on that point that you were making?
Well, let me give an example, because a lot of governments have been issuing orders to shut down internet connectivity and ban digital services. So service providers, for example, should use all available legal channels to push back on such requests from state agencies, whether they are official or informal. And if companies cannot resist demands in full, for example, they should ensure that any restrictions or disruptions are as limited as possible in duration and geographic space. But also, I think in some context, because a lot of times again, practically speaking, it may be difficult to do so. So what I have read and recommended is that prioritize users' freedom of expression and access to information, especially for content that can be considered journalism, discussion of human rights, educational material. So when you're unable to push back fully to government restrictions and shutdowns, you can be able to sort of circumvent this by ensuring that there's access to this information more widely without restrictions and less algorithm plays in different political, social, and cultural contexts, especially for the promotion of artistic expression and political and social expression within that space and context. I also think defining clearly guidelines in terms of services where this speech is not, where you're not limited, where freedom of speech is not limited and is not permissible. And when you're engaging with government, you're making it clear that these are the rules that you, as well as an organization, have to ensure that the government complies with. Because when you enter certain spaces, for example, in the Kenyan space, you're complying with Kenyan legislation. But you must ensure that when you are complying with that legislation, they are also not infringing on freedoms and expressions that are required for these platforms sort of to thrive and for people to engage with the same. So I hope I have answered the question, Alex, and if there are follow-up questions, I'm willing to engage on the same. But I feel that companies should push back. And often we've seen, I want to give the example of Ethiopia, Tanzania, and Uganda, and I'm often afraid to do so because you never know what could happen. But there wasn't pushback. When this happened, they were like, okay, if that's what you want, we're going to do it. We don't want to compromise revenue. We don't want to compromise what could be a long-term partnership indirectly with government. So we did not see any advocacy or engagement with government for alternative solutions when it came to government shutdowns. And this shouldn't be the case. Also, we found, again, like I mentioned earlier, a lot of companies are not engaging with local expertise and civil society, which leaves a lot of civil society organizations fighting alone. And because of lack of access and lack of power, often they lose these battles and fights. So there should be, I don't want to say a partnership, but sort of like cooperation and understanding where these companies engage with local expertise and civil society to find solutions that fit the current contexts and different countries as well.
A place of discussion where this exchange could happen between the civil society and these companies. I totally agree.
Definitely. How do we sort of square that?
So I actually wanted to add some specific recommendation that I put together in the report, in the infodemics report, because basically I think we look at what government can do, but I want to go back at what the companies can do also, or start now, waiting for a good democratic oversight to come and for government, civil society to find how it would work. And I want to maybe mention two things. So basically, one thing that I really push for in the recommendation in the report is for platforms to create advertisement library, but also a library of the content that are the most seen every day per country. Because today, only basically Facebook employees can see what are the contents seen today by the British people. And I feel that in the time of pandemic, in a time of election, it's actually a public need, a public interest to be able to know what are the contents most seen on major platforms such as Facebook, Twitter, but tomorrow new ones. And we see that there's some way towards that with Facebook creating quadtangle or things like that, but I think they should be improved. They should be, this kind of library should be made available to vetted researchers to be able to independently audit the information that are put towards the public, regulators, and to allow the public to know what's happening on our information space, basically. And I start with this hopefully concrete ideas of transparency. When we talk about transparency, what I think we can easily agree that that should be obvious, that the public, the regulators, vetted independent researchers should know what are the content most seen every day per country, and should know who is paying for which ad, targeting which public, what are the things that enter into the algorithm and that the algorithm show us, and who see that. And so basically the platform, they should start now building these tools, because yes, I understand it's a huge engineering process, and I'm sure that the regulators will go towards this kind of thing. So the platform should start and show good behavior and do that on their own. So creating an ad library, creating a library of content most seen on major platforms, I think are ideas that are pretty concrete and obvious.
Thanks, Del. Sorry, Natasha, come on.
First of all, I love what Delphine said. Fantastic. I really do. I just wanted to add, I don't know if this is related, but companies should also thoroughly document government demands internally and notify users as to why connectivity in a certain place or content is restricted. So there's sort of like an indirect form of accountability, especially where the governments lack transparency. So you're letting the user know, listen, this is restricted because your government either has ensured that we need to do X, Y, Z. So this is we create a space where those who are able to sort of fight back and push either through civil society or any different space are able to do so using this content and using this information publicly shared. So this shouldn't be something that journalists or other people have to uncover or investigate. This should be information that the public is aware of. This is happening because the government has demanded for it to happen. So I think it should be published regularly and for everybody to understand the context in which these companies are operating and why.
I completely agree. I think that's of critical importance, thinking about both kind of computational transparency in understanding what is taking place in an online space as large as some of the major platforms. You know, our internet must be comprehensible in that respect, but also, you know, understanding policy rules, that needs to be done in a way that's clear, and questions of redress, questions of accountability. I think these things shouldn't be, as we've heard from Delphine, this shouldn't be the subject of scandal and investigative journalism. It should just be publicly available information. We've only got 5 minutes left, so I want to finish up with two sort of challenging questions, I suppose. The first, rather sinister, an anonymous account has asked, is Tick-Tock a threat to national security? So perhaps be careful with how you answer that one. And my other question would be, you know, Jane has asked what our thoughts are on end-to-end encryption. I'd like to phrase that a little bit differently. Should we be, you know, when thinking about end-to-end encryption, which for those who are not familiar with is a technology that looks to protect the communications between two people and protect it from oversight, let's say. Should we be working with end-to-end encryption through end-to-end encryption or against end-to-end encryption? Which of those options do you like? So, is TikTok a threat to national security, and what do we do about end-to-end encryption? Damien, perhaps we could come to you first.
So with data, TikTok has got a data acquisitive model that is just as rapacious as Facebook, if not more so. So they have designed ad tools for TikTok that are more or less the same as the ones Facebook has got. So you've got to ask the question: what do they want all that data for? Is it just to create an ad-funded business that is potentially could be as big as Facebook in the future? And who else has access to that data? Would the Chinese state ultimately have access to that data if they wanted to? I'm sure TikTok would say no, but nevertheless, it's a fair question to ask. So I think the question about TikTok is really sort of, where does our data go? When companies are gathering more and more data about everybody to create an advertising market that's ever more efficient, which they can make money out of. Is that really a prize worth having, for a society? To say actually the efficiency of advertising is such an important goal that we should give all our data away about everything we think and do in order to be more perfectly targeted with ads. And who has that data? And these are questions we should ask. We should ask in the context of Facebook. We should ask in the context of TikTok. I wouldn't want to see a sort of surveillance state model develop here as the successor to a surveillance capitalism model. As Peter said at the beginning, that would that's what totalitarianism looks like at the end of the day. The question of end-to-end encryption. I mean, I think the reason why do Facebook want to have end-to-end encryption on all of their messaging tools? I think principally so they can't be responsible for what anyone says. So and then you look at the way think tools like WhatsApp are used, particularly in countries like India, in Nigeria, in Brazil, these countries where we've seen big problems of violence coordinated through end-to-end encryption services. So I think the idea of that being the generic form of internet communication, I think is something we should be concerned about. We need to, we want to make people's data and information secure. At the same time, we need to know enough about what's going on that we can try and disrupt known harmful threats to society. And in India, I was talking to a member of the Indian Parliament, Shashi Tharoor, a few weeks ago, and in India we've seen like lynchings and riot mobs organised on WhatsApp to target minority people within a community, and we have to recognise that as something that is a genuinely dangerous threat.
Thanks, Damien. I think, Peter, we were running low on time. I guess we'll come to you as a sort of last speaker here before we wrap up. Yeah, what do you make of it? TikTok or end-to-end encryption?
So it was. I interviewed Audrey Tang, the very famous Taiwanese minister for all things digital, and she was like, look, our policy is very simple. If there's any chance that the data gets into the hands of the Chinese Communist Party, we don't do business. And because these companies can't guarantee that, even if they mean well, even if they're trying their best, the fact that there's a huge risk of that happening, we don't work with them. And she was just kind of finding it quite funny that European countries were only going through these agonies now, and they've been through them. Look, we can learn a huge amount from two countries, Taiwan and Estonia. I think these are countries that have really been thinking about the kind of the dynamics of balancing democracy, security, integrity, pluralism, polarization very, very intensely, because these are countries for whom this is existential, and who are very technologically advanced. So we can learn a huge amount. I certainly don't think that sort of like Britain or the US have any of the big answers here. There could well be countries in Africa, and amazing actually ideas in Brazil around online digital participation. We talk about the future of democracy being all about people getting involved in local democracy online. Brazil is really the pioneer. We have so much to learn, and certainly kind of the classical countries you associate with liberal democratic success might have the least to teach.
Guys, we're out of time. Thank you so much on behalf of Demos and our hosts. It was a really, really fascinating debate. I hope that it was interesting for everybody watching. I think it is the main question. It's the big question that we're trying to answer. And as we can see, we come at it from many different angles, whether it's values based, whether it's technology based, whether it's legal a legal basis, and so on. So thank you so much, Damien, Natasha, Peter, Delphine. Thanks to everybody who participated in the chat and asked questions. That was great. Just a reminder to say hello in the chat, respond to what you're reading, update your profile, make a connection, fall in love, get married on the blockchain. Later today, Polly, our chief executive, will be unpicking some of the big questions about the internet we hear about every day with the help of 3 experts on tech and society. But before that, I'm super excited to speak with Paul, who's Deputy Director at GCHQ, to talk about security, sovereignty, and the role GCHQ plays in protecting citizens online. So it's a really exciting opportunity to do that. So we'll be here in about 15 minutes. Thanks again to all my panelists, and see you shortly.